Everybody. My wife Carol and I live in Mount Vernon, and I will tell you that we moved to Mount Vernon 13 years ago from Boise, Idaho. And one of the selling points of Mount Vernon to us, aside from the fact that it was close to our first grandchild, was its proximity to Whidbey Island, and in particular Coupeville. I love this area. I really consider it my second home, regardless of the fact that we couldn't afford to live here. But never mind. It's very accessible. I have what I consider to be two spirit places, and they are both Camas prairies. One of those is the area around Grangeville, Idaho, which is just a little south of Lewiston. If you've never been there, make it a point to go. It is spectacularly beautiful. I would recommend that you go to Cottonwood and stay at St. Gertrude's Inn. It's a Benedictine monastery with a wonderful guest house. But my other spirit place is
Camas are blooming.
And when do they bloom there?
April to
April.
June, depending on the weather.
Oh, okay.
My other spirit place is out here. And I felt that immediate connection the first time I set eyes on it. We just love coming here. I want to talk to you today about Dick Fallis. And first of all, I want to address the elephant in the room. When I first started reading about Dick, I was pronouncing his last name as Fallis. And I think part of that is coming from a fairly straight-laced Midwestern family. I just had a hard time with the juxtaposition of that first and last name. I will tell you that our 11 and 14-year-old grandsons thought it was quite funny. But as we used to say in Silicon Valley, if you can't fix it, feature it. Dick Fallis is remembered as one of Skagit Valley's foremost chroniclers. He was a man who taught history in classrooms, preserved it through newspapers, shared it in books and lectures, and fittingly, nourished his community with freshly baked bread. Fallis devoted much of his life to documenting the people, places, and stories that shaped Northwest Washington, and his work preserved countless aspects of Skagit County's heritage and helped foster a renewed appreciation for the region's historic communities. His legacy endures in the streets of LaConner in Mount Vernon, in the archives of Skagit County, and in the memories of the many readers who continue to discover the rich history he worked so diligently to preserve. Richard E. Fallis was born January 31st, 1926, in Jonesboro, Indiana. He was the fourth of 5 children with an ancestry of farmers, merchants, and Quakers, which is one of the ways that I relate to him because my grandfather was a Quaker. He served in the U.S. Navy in the Pacific during World War II. And I was doing the math on that. He was born in 26. You figure, how old would he have been at the outbreak of the Second World War? So I'm guessing he probably served toward the end of the war. In any event, after leaving the Navy, he pursued a college degree in English, Communications, History, and Education. Thank you, GI Bill. 1956 found him married to Bernice Levitsky and living in Seattle, where he made his Quaker declaration the following year on the occasion of the birth of the first of his 3 children. Do we have any Quakers in the audience? I didn't think so. So you might be wondering...
I'm married in Quaker meeting.
All right, very good. Well, any idea of what the Quaker Declaration might be about? That was the first question I had, is what in the heck is the Quaker Declaration? The most famous Quaker Declaration was formerly titled A Declaration from the Harmless and Innocent People of God, called Quakers, against all plotters and fighters in the world, presented to the newly restored King Charles II of England. I'll let this plane go by. We'll all listen to the sound of freedom, and then I'll continue.
Time to reflect.
Time to reflect. Speaking of Quakers, it's a military jet. In a strategic effort to protect Quakers from political persecution after an armed uprising by a radical group called the Fifth Monarchists. Part of that declaration was, all bloody principles and practices we do utterly deny, with all outward wars and strife and fightings with outward weapons for any end or under any pretense whatsoever, and this is our testimony to the whole world. Dick began his teaching career in Granite Falls High School, and it was in Granite Falls that he developed a lifelong interest in local history and founded the community's annual Railroad Days celebration, which still continues, demonstrating his belief that history should be experienced and celebrated by the public rather than confined to archives. And as I continue on the narrative of his life, you're going to see that theme over and over again, demonstrated in ways that remain manifest today in the Skagit Valley. Falls later joined the faculty of Skagit Valley College at Oak Harbor, so here's his Whidbey Island connection, as an instructor in journalism and communications. He encouraged students to value careful research, clear writing, and community engagement. He also advised the college newspaper, mentoring aspiring journalists while emphasizing the importance of preserving local stories. It was at Skagit Valley College in the early 1970s that Dick became acquainted with Wally Funk, himself a well-known documentarian of local history as well as a newspaper publisher in Anacortes. And if you've read anything about the history of Anacortes, at least the more modern history, Wally Funk is very much a notable individual. Funk told him about a newspaper that was for sale in LaConner and encouraged him to look into purchasing it. The newspaper in question was none other than the Puget Sound Mail, which had the distinction of being the longest surviving weekly newspaper in the state, having been originally launched as the Bellingham Bay Mail in 1873, and it was relocated to LaConner 6 years later by its original publisher, James A. Power. The story told by one chronicler of Dick's life, who I depended a lot on in my research, a fellow by the name of Tony Flynn, was that Fallis's initial impression of LaConner, quote, was that it was tired and run down, but full of history and ambiance. He learned that some prominent people in town were hoping the Puget Sound Mail would fail, and that owner Patrick O'Leary would sell it to them cheap so that they would have control over the news that went out to its citizens. Instead, Fallis made an offer and soon became its publisher, which didn't please everyone, he noted. Operating largely as a one-man newspaper, Fallis used its pages not merely to report local events, but to champion historic preservation and civic involvement. The same week that Dick purchased the paper, LaConner's iconic Gatch's Mansion burned down. Through Fallis's coverage and historic background on the building, as well as his efforts through the newspaper, a grassroots campaign was created to rebuild and restore the site and then get it named to the National Register of Historic Buildings. Have any of you seen this building in question? It is. That is correct. It is now the Pacific Northwest Quilt and Fiber Arts Museum, and it is an absolute gem. I'd say certainly one of the jewels of LaConner's crown. I'm going to read to you, because part of what I wanted to do today was not just tell you about Dick Fallis, but share his voice. And a good way to do that is through a collection of selected stories that were posthumously published by a gentleman named Dan Royal, who I got to know as a result of my wanting to learn more about Dick. This is called LaConner. You must discover it for yourself. Don't expect me to give you any pat and final definition of what LaConner is. The town, though old, has its own dynamics and is still very much alive with whatever degree of interaction between the place and its people. And are you able to hear me okay back here, Kim? Okay. That is to say that a person must discover it for himself. The town does have its own distinctive character as a place. Its pastness is still here, and it is genuine. These are the buildings that were here at the turn of the century, for the most part, but the town isn't stuck and pinioned in the past like a museum display or tourist setup. It is not a restoration, but a survival of real and spirited waterfront community of early days on Puget Sound. It is at once both a very old town and one of the most contemporary places you can find. The Swinomish Channel runs past the town as it always has done, connecting the saltwater bays at either end. Of course, that would be Padilla and Skagit, or flowing back and forth with the tides, keeping its own rhythm. The lush agricultural fields surrounding the town, land reclaimed from the salt marsh and tide flats, and now some of the most productive farmland in the world, always has its own rhythms and seasons, and it is by these rather than artificial time that the town moves. Bulb crops, hyacinth, daffodils, tulips, and iris bud early, and many hands are employed picking fresh flowers, preparing them for shipment and later storing and packaging bulbs that will be sold all over the world. Strawberries come in while the peas are blossoming and the canneries gear up for a marathon race as viners gather up the crops sweeping across the valley. Now there's one indication right there of when this would have been written, because you do not find pea viners these days in the Skagit Valley. Cucumbers are a major field crop, requiring much hand care, and seed crops, some needing 2 years of cultivation, have their own drama, not to mention grain and other food crops sprouting, blossoming, and bearing. I'm going to put in, as a quick aside, a plug for the Skagit County Historical Museum, top of the hill in La Conner. Their current exhibit, which will run through sometime in October, is called Where Our Food Comes From. And it is based on a photojournalist who spent a number of years, I think particularly during the pandemic, getting to know 7 different farming families, and not just the families, but the agricultural workers. And through words and images tells their story. And it really gives you a very strong sense of the agricultural identity of the Skagit Valley. It is well worth seeing. This is also dairy country, with fields of sturdy white and black cows grazing contentedly, often interspersed with flocks of white and gray gulls. Memories of the once sea-held land are often blurred, and time here is not fixed as on a calendar, for eras often overlap. On the channel, the boats come and go, as they have since man was first here to propel them, only now there are an estimated 1,000 boats that make their moorage in the La Conner area. Indian war canoes can still be seen on occasion, sailboats with full rigging, and even stern-wheelers and steamboats. I can't say I've seen any at the time we've lived there, though not in the quantity or the haste as before. Most now are pleasure boats, though fishing boats serve canneries and packing plants on both sides of the channel. Tugs towing log rafts and other freight, sometimes huge barges, are also very much a part of the channel scene. Once a main route of commerce threading through this Puget Sound country, and passenger boats also arrive from time to time, bringing visitors here for a friendly stopover on the way to other coastal towns and island destinations. But this last is not yet again on a scale as before. There is hope that we will progress back to inter-community visitation where people and places are real. In the town, the taverns, bars, and restaurants, the pizza parlor, drive-in and delicatessen, the grocery stores, gas stations, lumberyard, antique dealers, and shops and services, both small scale and large, life carries on at whatever pace the participants pursue it. Also, the schools in season, the 2 churches, the County Historical Museum at the crown of the hill, the yacht club, and other social, recreational, civic, and community organizations provide many opportunities for fun, growth, and good works, capital G, capital W. And though much of the town is contained in the Historic Preservation District, protected by inclusion in the National Register of Historic Places, there is also much that is new to be discovered, as well as old to be preserved or to be brought back. For the record, first attempts at settlement here were from other places within the region. In 1855, a party from the settled area of Whidbey Island sought to establish homes near the mouth of the Skagit River, but was turned back due to threatened Indian uprisings. Samuel Calhoun came in the spring of 1863 from Utsalati on Camano Island, where he had been working for the Puget Sound Mill Company. He had wondered what lay over the divide and had come with an Indian canoe to explore the backwaters, finding a place very much to his liking, where he staked out a claim and then went back to Utsalati to prepare for homesteading. When he came back to his intended location, he found Michael J. Sullivan on a location nearby. He might have been there earlier, and it is an unsolved question whether Michael Sullivan or Samuel Calhoun were the first settlers on the Swinomish Flats, or whether there had been others there before them. However, Calhoun and Sullivan were the first to take up permanent claims there, and they began draining and diking the land in mutual effort, producing good crops of oats and hay the first year. Others soon followed, including John Cornelius, Richard White, and James Harrison, with the Sullivan Slough, Pleasant Ridge, and Dodge Valley first to be settled. I don't know if you've ever spent any time in Dodge Valley or in Pleasant Ridge, but I highly recommend it. Beautiful areas, and I would put the Pleasant Ridge Cemetery right up there on a par with Sunnyside in terms of the notable pioneers who were buried there. Plus, it's gorgeous. The first trading post was established on the Swinomish Channel in the spring of 1867 by Alonzo Lowe, who had been one of the initial settlers at Alki, later Seattle. He had moved to Snohomish City, where he was associated in a mercantile firm, and the Swinomish store was to be a branch. It didn't make it, however, and Lowe had the goods delivered back to Snohomish by a black man named Clark, who acquired the defunct trading post building for his services. This, we believe, was on the reservation side of the channel. Nothing more is mentioned in the histories about this black man named Clark, who acquired a substantial building, but they don't tell us much about Lowe from that point on either. The first permanent trading post to be established at the present site of LaConner was in 1868 by Thomas Hayes. We know what happened to it, for it was purchased in 1869 by John S. Connor and Louisa A. Connor, who established the LaConner post office there and helped to develop the town around it. And of course, the town of LaConner is named after Louisa Connor. This same store was sold in 1873 to George Gatchis and James Gatchis, originally from Peterborough, England, who developed it into one of the most active and prosperous general merchandise stores in the northern Puget Sound region, soon replacing the wood frame building with a substantial two-story brick store and warehouse. The Connor family, meanwhile, were developing their town property and also working with others at draining and diking the surrounding marshes, creating valuable farmland. In its natural state, where not under flood or tidewater, this land was already producing good stands of marsh hay. When diked and brought under cultivation, record crops of oats could be produced. And I have to tell you, when I was reading, there's a book called Steamboat Town about the history of LaConner. And I found it really interesting that the first really important economic driver of that area was oats. And I'm thinking, I mean, how many oats can people eat, for crying out loud? What's with all the oats? Well, think about it. Oats are food. And what is food? Food is a form of fuel. This may not be impressive now until you realize that the country was literally run on horsepower up to the turn of the century, when railroads and steam engines became dominant and oats and hay were the energy sources, the fuel that powered the expanding America. Good sources of that fuel were as much in demand as competitively sought as oil wells are now. The Gatchis brothers, besides their mercantile operations, engaged in the shipping of hay and grain, claiming credit for opening the coast market to the produce of this region. Sharp and ambitious operators like the young Joshua Green learned that they could make a fortune by taking a shallow draft stern wheeler up the sloughs on a high tide to the farmer's barn, loading it quickly and getting out on the same high tide. One thing about those shallow draft stern wheelers, They didn't venture far out into the open straits or a rough sea, for if the paddle wheels were lifted out of the water, the engines could race and burn themselves out. They always sought the most protective waterways, and the Swinomish Channel, though sometimes too shallow for heavier craft, was a favored route for the cargo and passenger carrying sternwheelers. Laconner was a happy and friendly stopping place when most of the commerce on Puget Sound was by way of water. As a hospitable place and trading center on the main route of commerce, Laconner flourished up to the turn of the century when railroads and later highways changed the main commercial routes, leaving Laconner in the backwaters. It was during the flourishing times that the buildings in Laconner had been constructed, the hotels and commercial buildings, the eating places, docks all along the waterfront, the churches, schools, and fine homes. Some fortunes had been made in Laconner, but these were generally by people who then moved away, investing their fortunes elsewhere. There was a more equitable balance, ranging from agreeably prosperous to getting along comfortably. Those who had it were generous with those who had less. The Connor family gave willingly of their land for parks, for public mortgage, whatever would benefit the community, and others did likewise. Louisa Connor, a small but dynamic, determined woman, had worked from the beginning to establish a church, proper schools, and others did likewise to establish and support a library, a civic club, and other amenities of a real community. The record is replete with good women pursuing good causes, and with good men shouldering their responsibilities and getting the job done. Laconner did not become a ghost town even though the routes of commerce changed. The channel was still here, still used by the commercial and fishing boats, and the agricultural land still produced needed food crops, both supplying the canneries and food processing firms. Laconner was still the best place to get farm implements, machinery, and hardware, and it remained a hospitable place for lodge meetings for visitors to return. But it moved with the rhythms of the channel, with the seasons of the field, rather than with the fashions, keeping up to the moment like other towns. It held on to what it had It held on to what it had because it couldn't afford to throw it away or replace it with something more modern, more up to date. And it holds now to the envy of towns that lost themselves, their identity of place, and their sense of continuity in keeping up with the times. Let's return back to Mr. Fallis, or Fallis, pardon me. See, I still want to pronounce it wrong. Dick also got the town of Laconner declared a historic district, requiring all future buildings to meet historic building standards, and played an important role in preserving the town's distinctive 19th century character, now recognized as one of Washington's premier historic communities, which again did not please everyone. When the Shelter Bay community was being created, Fallis teamed up with its developer to provide the purchaser of every lot with a year's subscription to the Puget Sound Mail to help them become more familiar with their new homes. This tactic paid off as subscriptions increased and the paper grew. According to Tony Flynn's story, the newspaper came to an end when a rival emerged in the form of the Channeltown Press. The Channeltown Press started up in opposition to me, said Fallis. They had the press and were able to put it out more efficiently than I was. I was a one-man operation. Dick ended up selling the O'Leary building. It was a good time to sell, he said. The paper had served its purpose and with my help had saved Laconner. That's something I'm very proud of. It should here be noted for the record that one of the reasons that Dick was able to survive as a one-man news operation was due to the fact that his wife Bernice was employed full-time by the Skagit Valley Hospital. So even then, it was not easy making a living in the newspaper business. Following the sale of his newspaper, Dick returned to teaching at Skagit Valley College, this time at the Mount Vernon campus. He was also an advisor to the college's Cardinal newspaper. After a couple of years of being a journalism instructor, he decided to become a student and subsequently enrolled in SVC's culinary arts program, where he learned to bake bread. A decision that was no doubt inspired by his fondness of crusty Italian loaves. And who doesn't love crusty Italian loaves? Dick found that he had a talent for baking bread, and even his instructor, Reed Bennett, requested that Fallis bake extra loaves for him to take home. In comparing his roles as newspaper man and baker, Dick Riley remarked, You can bake a loaf of bread and have fun doing it, and no one will come up and say I didn't put enough salt in it. I can make a good enough living at it. It's enjoyable, and I get no arguments from a loaf of bread. Increasing demand for his bread convinced Dick to become a full-time baker, and he started baking 30 loaves a week that were sold through Snow Goose Produce. As his reputation grew, Dick was selling bread as fast as he could bake it, and in 1993 he opened the Bridgeside Bakery, the name of this book, inside the old Carnation Condensery building in downtown Mount Vernon, which you may be familiar with. It's that big white building that's just on the west side, the east side of the Division Street Bridge. Anybody gone over the Division Street Bridge lately? Oh my goodness. Yeah, it's in the process of being painted in.
Long process.
Yeah, long process. Increasing demand for his bread convinced Dick to become a full-time baker. I already read that. A couple of years later, he went to work for a bakery in Seattle, but after a couple more years, he and Bernice decided to move back to the Skagit Valley. He started selling his loaves locally at the Saturday Farmers Market and expanded to take in the Wednesday Farmers Market at Skagit Valley Hospital. They were still doing that, hon, when we moved to Mount Vernon, but I don't think they do that anymore. Even as Dick was becoming known as the bread man of Mount Vernon, the 3 decades following the sale of the Puget Sound Mail were also highly productive in terms of his output as a researcher, writer, and historian. He took on the role of Skagit County Pioneer Association's historian memorialist, a position previously held by John Conrad. The two had worked together for a number of years since the Mail published annual pioneer editions of the newspaper. Most notably, he was instrumental in organizing the association's 100-year anniversary, a year-long celebration. Other organizations that benefited from Dick's involvement were the Skagit County Historical Society and Museum, where he served as trustee and president, the Skagit Valley Friends Meeting, yay Quakers, in which he served as charter member and clerk, the LaConner Rotary, the LaConner Legion Post, and LaConner Landmarks, where as a charter member, he played a major role in the aforementioned effort of getting the town of LaConner on the National Register of Historical Places. Beyond journalism, Fallis became one of Skagit County's most prolific local historians. Through newspaper columns, walking tours, lectures, and books, he interpreted the region's pioneer settlements, native history, agriculture, transportation, architecture, and everyday life. His writing combined careful archival research with engaging storytelling, making local history accessible to both scholars and general readers. Dick produced many books on local history through his own Skagit Advocate Publishing, including a biography of an early Skagit County preacher, B.N.L. Davis, and Amid Fields of Elysium, a year at Northern State. He wrote countless historical columns for the Skagit Valley Herald in the 1980s and the Skagit Argus in the 1990s. He promoted and found funding for monuments that included the Maiden of Deception Pass, and we'll be talking more about that in just a little bit. The River Jam Memorial and the Jasper Gates Father of Mount Vernon statue on 1st and Gate Street in Mount Vernon. By the way, the only statue in Mount Vernon. All of which were done in collaboration with sculptor Tracy W. Powell. He kept the birthday of Skagit County, which is November 28, 1883, alive by baking an annual birthday cake for county commissioners. His publications, including Fields of Elysium and the posthumously compiled Bridgeside, selected stories of Dick Fallis, remain valuable resources for researchers and residents interested in the county's past. In the summer of 2006, Bernice, Dick's wife of 53 years, passed away, which led to his decision to retire the following year at 81 from, as Tony Flynn described it, the job he never officially had. He had never been adept with computers and had relied on Bernice to typeset his documents. His duties with the Pioneer Association were passed on to his friend Dan Royal, who worked with the Skagit Valley Genealogical Society and whose roots in Birdsview area stretch back to 1878. Dan, by the way, is currently in the midst of writing a book about his family, which includes the Savages, George Savage had the distinction, I think, of setting up the first lumber mill for Equality Colony in Bow. With Dick's assistance, Dan began the task of compiling his friend's historic columns and writings gathered from various county newspapers, including the Puget Sound Mail, the Skagit Valley Herald, the Argus, and other sources. As Tony Flynn noted in his 2007 story, Dick wasn't afraid of ruffling some feathers when it came to being faithful to history, especially where the treatment of indigenous people was concerned. Dick said, "You make enemies. That's one of the reasons I'm glad I'm retiring. These people who say I'm claiming to be the historian of Skagit County, I'm an historian. I'm not the final authority." Dick Fallis passed away in 2011. He left this world in a manner that I hope that I can duplicate, peacefully at home with family by his side. He was living at the Lacana Retirement Inn at the time. The previous year, he was honored by Granite Falls, the place where his love of sharing history began, by being named Grand Marshal of the event that he had founded, Railroad Days. The Skagit County Historical Museum became the benefactor and publisher of his written histories of the county. His daughter Sarah wrote, "He left behind a legacy of community service, a love of history, the environment, and of life. He often remarked about the act of breaking bread with someone as the ultimate sign of trust and friendship, noting that the word companion is literally taken from the Latin companis, or with bread." Throughout his career, Fallis viewed history as a public trust. He believed communities could better understand themselves by preserving their stories, buildings, and traditions. His efforts inspired generations of local historians, journalists, preservationists, and educators who continue to build upon the foundation he established. I was at least 2 years too late in having the opportunity to meet Dick Fallis, but as I spend time with the stories he wrote and share them through future Tales of the Magic Skagit podcast episodes, I feel a profound sense of kinship. I think we would have gotten along quite well. If for one thing, I really appreciate a good loaf of crusty Italian bread. I'm going to read another story, and then I'm going to treat you to something that is a complete exclusive. It's something that I received from Dan Royal as a typed manuscript that Dick had put together, but it was never published in anywhere. You're going to hear it for the first time. Lucky you. I want to talk about the Maiden of Deception Pass. So probably most of you have seen it. This is the story that Dick wrote, at least the published one. Then I'm going to treat you to the one that never got published, never saw the light of day, which talks about his own involvement. How a Maiden Charmed Deception Pass. An interesting aspect of Indian legends of this region is that women or young maidens are often pictured as heroines who, through acts of self-sacrifice or exceptional action, managed to save their tribe or bring them back from starvation to prosperity. A case in point is the traditional story of the Samish people told by the late Chief Martin Sampson about Kokwalawut, the Maiden of Deception Pass. The Samish holdings covered a roughly triangular stretch of territory that included Cypress and Sinclair Islands at its northern point, Samish Island at its eastern point, down to include western Fidalgo Island to a southern point just at the outer entrance to Deception Pass. The story takes place as what is now known as Rosario Beach, which is part of Deception Pass State Park. For many years, it was part of a military reserve, guarding the spectacular entrance into Skagit Bay and Puget Sound, and for uncounted hundreds of years before that, it was a snug and protected village site of the Samish people. Kokwalawut, with other maidens of the village, would gather what they needed of the plentiful shellfish from the broad sandy beach that looked outward through the open straits along the coasts of nearby islands or around through the narrow high-walled gorge where waters would rush in frenzied whirlpools with each changing of the tide. And I'm sure all of you can picture that in your minds because we've all seen it. She had gathered shellfish here from the time she was barely able to toddle after the other maidens until now when she was fairly grown, and she was all the more filled with gratitude to the spirits of this place, who had made her a life, who had made her life a time of happiness and laughter in this magic place, where one only had to reach out her hand to receive all that she could desire. Besides the clams, mussels, crab, and other morsels from the beach, a stream of pure water came down from the high cliff to the village below. The surrounding wooded banks held berries and edible roots, and beyond that, on the highland, there was an abundance of game and birds, all that they could want for little more than reaching out a hand, gathered as easily as one might reach out and gather the agates and moonstones that can be found along this enchanted beach. On a particular morning, according to the legend, Woot reached down for a fat clam that almost seemed to rise through the liquid sand and for her fingertips. But as she thought she had it, it slipped from her hand and floated at the arbitrary truce line that divides the land from the sea. She reached for it again, and once more it slipped from her hand, now into the deeper water. With no thought other than to have that clam, she waited out until the tide was pulling with some strength against her legs, drawing her further and further in, and she was suddenly startled by the insistence of the tide and a sense of danger. But just as she pulled her outreached hand back toward her mouth to stop the cry of fear, it was as though a spirit from the water reached out, held her hand with calming reassurance, placing the fat clam in her palm, closing her fingers around it. Again that evening, when the tide was rising, flowing toward the narrow gorge with a heavy, solemn body of water that then burst into a great frothing joy and laughter, Woot waded out into the swirling waters. She did not need the mysterious clam to lead her, but walked on with her fingers extended towards the rising tide until her hands were held in cool embrace. There she stood, waist deep in water that was strangely calm around her, though the rush of the waters just beyond was of a strength that could hurl timbers high up on the beach or pull down cliffs of solid stone and grind them into sand. To her, it was like the tide that smoothed the sharp and broken edges of the earth, and she was fulfilled by the spirit of the tide, just as the rocks and drying sand of the beach are fulfilled by returning tide. She went back at every change of tide, and soon was swimming in the water, spending all her time there, finding new strength and joy in her slight body as she braved the tides. She even practiced staying under the surface of the water. Her friends and family could not help but notice the changes that were coming over her, and planned among themselves to take her to a village far inland from the sea, where she would not be exposed to the dangerous consequences of her obsession with the rushing tide. Woot learned of their plans, and when she could, she would slip down to the edge of the water and swim off, lamenting to the waves that she may have to leave her village by the sea, and that she would rather drown herself, so her spirit might be there forever. She begged the sea to take her deep within its borders where she might remain. Instead, the waves lifted her above the waters and carried her gently to the shore at the foot of her village. This time, emerging from the waves, was the figure of a young man who walked with her as though they had long been intimately acquainted, holding her hand as they approached the dwelling of her family. In the twilight, he appeared to have a definite green tint to the Indians who peered at him, wondering who he was, and they were chilled and repelled by the cool dampness of the air around him. The strange young man confessed to the father that he was from the sea and that he had loved Woot from a long time, and now he wanted her for his bride to come and live with him in his realm. The father was outraged, protesting that his daughter had been spied on by the stranger who took advantage of her trusting nature and now wanted to change her entirely from the ways of her people and take her away. He absolutely refused to allow his daughter to ever again go near the water or to have anything more to do with the beach. The stranger withdrew from the hut of Woot and her family, and the spirit also withdrew from the rush of the tides. The waters still laid there far down the beach, but they did not rise and fall, and the great fish began to die, since there was no current to ride. Those that had been stranded on the beach and all the shellfish on the drying shores began to wither and die and rot with no returning waves to wash it away. The water no longer rushed through the gorge of Deception Pass, and high up on the cliff, the pure stream of fresh water washed down only brown silt, and the animals and berry bushes that had been nourished by it also began to wither and die. Woot, who had withdrawn partly in obedience to her father and partly because she was a little afraid and startled by the strange young man, now saw the suffering of her people and was ashamed of having thought only of herself. She begged her father to let her go with the spirit of the water, and he agreed, asking only that she return from time to time to assure her family that she was well and happy. With that, she went out to where the waters waited silently, dived in, giving herself entirely to the spirit of the sea. Instantly, the waves began to move, catching a sparkle from the heavens, and again began to roll pebbles on the beach and swirl through the pass with an awesome, joyful movement like that of whales at play. The stream above again ran clear. The vines became heavy with fruit, and animals returned along the banks in even larger numbers. The wounds of earth were quickly healed, and the beach again produced the shellfish as fat and succulent as the clam that had first slipped from Kokwalawut's hand. In a year, she herself returned from the waters for a visit with her people and was glad to see how they now prospered. They too were glad to see her and how strong she had grown, how happy she appeared to be. But they were bothered by a coolness, a dampness that almost clung to them, taking their breath away if they came close to her, and they could not help but notice that her long black hair, of which she was once so proud, now had a greenish tint, and there were ribbons of seaweed in it. Her people told her that she need not return each year if she would rather not leave the sea. It would be enough if she would let them know from time to time that all was well. With that, the people watched for her who had saved the people, looking out for their welfare and keeping them in prosperity. So what I want to read to you now is, as I mentioned earlier, a manuscript that Dick, or probably Bernice, had typed, but was never published. The foregoing is one version of the story of the Maid of Deception Pass. It is more restrained than some of the more recent romanticized tellings, though somewhat longer than the starkest Indian versions, but I think that it does hold true to all the essentials of a story that exists in outline form, to be remembered by the elders and passed down to younger generations as required, with whatever additions and augmentation that might add to the color and flavor of the story, without changing the essential lesson it was intended to convey, leading its hearers to wisdom. The function of such a story or legend, I would suggest, in a society that has no literature other than that in an oral tradition, is not to entertain, but to instruct. There is no explanation for such an elaborate system other than to view it as a means of transmitting essential knowledge from one generation to the next. So the members of a particular tribe or family have this knowledge and power. As to the meaning or significance of the Kokwalawut story, at a primary level, it teaches that the Samish people have a direct connection with the power and spirit of the tides through the elevation of the Samish maiden, and that those who believe the story is literally true also have some means of control over those forces through calling on the maiden for intercession. On another level, even more universal, the story teaches that we must respect and be aware of the moods and conditions of the sea on which we are all dependent for our survival, and do not do anything that might disrupt that delicate balance. There are other levels of meaning and significance that make it unique and also link it with other stories and legends in world literature, helping to provide insights and understanding into these other stories, but I don't want to belabor that point just now. Although there is no way of knowing how long this story has been a part of the Samish Indian teachings, only that it dates back over many generations as one of their most valued possessions, it did find its way into print in 1938 in a small booklet of tribal legends collected by Martin J. Sampson. A totem, or story pole, had been carved and set in place on the Swinomish Reservation as part of a construction project there, and the figures selected to be carved on the pole represented legends and spirit guides of the various tribes that are included within the Swinomish tribal community. The story of Kokwalawut, the Maiden of Deception Pass, was included on the pole to represent the Samish people, and so a version of her story was included in the little booklet by Martin Sampson, telling the stories represented by the carvings. The booklet received very little public attention, though I understand that the author, a respected Indian leader, came under heavy criticism from Indians who still believed in the old ways, as well as from Indians who had turned away from the old beliefs and practices. The one group seems to have protested that their private spirits were being exposed and thus weakened and diminished, and the converted Indians seemed to feel that they were being compromised, as though they still took such primitive things seriously. Unfortunately, the Swinomish totem pole, too, received very little public attention of a positive nature, though it was the subject of some controversy and ridicule. This was the pole with the American eagle on the top, perched over a likeness of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, under whose administration WPA funds had been made available for the reconstruction of a public hall and for the carving of the pole. The fact that the pole had been carved under the direction of Charlie Edwards, an accomplished Samish Indian carver, should have commanded more serious attention. However, uninitiated persons accustomed only to the highly stylized carvings and designs of the northern Indians would have had a hard time this relatively simple, straightforward rendering of different spirits and benefactors, even without the elevated visage of FDR. Sampson and other knowledgeable people had no such delusion, and it was supposed to be like a northern totem pole, but was instead in the tradition of Puget Sound and Coast Salish Indians, and was used on carved house posts. In the introduction to his book, Martin Sampson states quite clearly, "The totem pole is an Alaskan idea, and is not our aim to copy the recordings of a family history on the pole or to copy the style of carving, but rather to build a monument to the Northwest Indians, reproducing a collection of carvings hitherto seen only in the pillars of the large council halls of the various tribes, where the carvings on the pillars supporting the roof depicted the history, tradition, legends, and religion of the Northwest Indians." The pole had rotted at the base after some 40 years of standing amid more abuse than anything else. It was taken down and placed ignominiously on its side behind one of the halls for a long time, while a new debate went on as to whether the pole could be salvaged and put back up, or whether anyone really thought that it would matter. Although the pole was quite badly decayed, the figures themselves were in relatively good condition. Then someone hit on the idea that the figures could be removed from the pole, mounted on plaques, and placed at eye level around the rather stark walls of a longhouse study center that had been built to replace the old American Hall. This was accomplished quite recently, and the repainted and refurbished carved figures representing the spiritual beliefs and teachings of the various tribes of the reservation now have a beauty and dignity that is far more discernible than they ever did have as figures carved up and down on a 60-foot pole. At any rate, I made my first personal acquaintance with Coquallawoot by reading the brief history in Martin Sampson's book. Not being an Indian myself and not being particularly aware of the spiritual significance of the maiden in the eyes of the Samish people, I did feel that it was a charming and pretty story that very well suited the special qualities and beauty of Deception Pass. It was several years later, in the spring of 1983, again, this would have been the 100-year celebration of Skagit County, that I was able to make a deeper and more profound acquaintance with the legend of the maiden, and in a sense, my education then began. The occasion was the 100th anniversary of the creation of Skagit County, whose boundaries extend from the northern coves and promontories of Deception Pass to the crests of the Cascade Mountains. I then served with a committee charged with the responsibility of finding some project suitable for marking the centennial year of the county, and our hope was to draw from the resources of our past, create something that would be meaningful for the people of today and might yet be durable enough to command the interest and attention of generations still to come. At that point, the proposal was made that we might consider the commissioning of a huge cedar carving in the form of a story pole representing the legend of Deception Pass. For some time, Bill Mitchell, an artist, designer, and cultural activist in the Anacortes area, had been urging the Samish Indian leaders at their office and tribal headquarters in Anacortes to create some sort of totem or story pole that could help people recognize and identify some aspects of Samish Indian culture, particularly as that had been a dominant culture in which much of this region before the coming of white settlers. And any of you who have been in Anacortes and seen all the various murals there, those are the works that Bill Mitchell, those were all created by Bill Mitchell. The Indian leaders had agreed in principle, and it had decided that such a pole should represent their legend of Coquallawoot, and that it should certainly not be done in the northern style of totem carving, but should indeed be done in the Samish and Coast Salish tradition of more realistic figures, such as had graced their house posts. Bill Mitchell had done some preliminary design work for the maiden story pole, and had conceived that since the story was essentially one of transformation, that of maiden into eternal spirit of the sea, that the two sides of the pole could be utilized. The one side depicting her as the dutiful young Samish Indian girl, and the other side as the serene and spiritual queen of the sea. People walking around the pole when finished would have a clear visualization of the transformation that had taken place. Tracy Powell, a wood carver living near Anacortes, very much wanted to do the carving. He's not an Indian, but has a deep respect and admiration for authentic Indian carving and design, and was more than willing to do this carving within the spirit and under the guidance of Samish Indian leaders. The Samish, although they had a reputation as carvers and builders of canoes, longhouses, and story posts, saw in Tracy a chance to relearn and regain their ancient honored art and craft. That's where it stood at the time that it was proposed by Bill Mitchell as a centennial project. I talked immediately with Bill Mitchell, with several of the Samish leaders, and with Tracy Powell. Being myself somewhat familiar with the story of the maiden, I knew that it represented the very roots of culture in this area, and that it had an urgent message for us today. This was a chance to be of service to the maiden, and I was caught up in helping her in every way that I could. Let that sink in a moment. So here you have a guy, white guy, Western culture, who really understands the contribution of the first people and the importance of having their story told and involving them in how that story is told. Tracy, encouraged by my enthusiasm, carved a 20-inch scale model of the proposed large cedar sculpture, which was completed in just a few days, in time to accompany my presentation at the next meeting of the Skagit Centennial Committee. There was some resistance and negative response, as it seems there must be for every new and extraordinary idea, but I noticed that the small carving of the maiden seemed to have its own magic, needing only a few words of explanation to win over even the most skeptical and reluctant of people. There was no doubt but what the commissioning and completion of the carving representing Kolqualawut, the Maiden of Deception Pass, would be our major Skagit County centennial project, creating a lasting and impressive legacy at Rosario Beach, the site of the ancient Samish Indian village associated with her life and legend. Of course, there were many things yet to be done before all of this could be realized. We had to have the approval of the State Parks Department, of the Skagit County Commissioners, of Shoreline Management and Departments of Archaeology, who opposed the digging up of a culturally sensitive area in order to implant a cultural object. And there were the problems of finding, securing, and transporting a cedar tree that would be suitable for such an undertaking, and then of fixing the finished work in a place amid planning and preparation for suitable dedication ceremonies. It seemed that the least of the tasks were in making the decision and in following through with the actual carving. That, from my point of observation, was sheer joy, an enthralling and deeply rewarding experience. Even the problems and challenges of proceeding with the project were met head-on, and it seemed that those most crucial to success, who had the power and authority to bring it to a halt or help it along, invariably became champions of the project, lending full energies and support to its success. This very positive and compelling flow of events I attributed directly to the power of the maiden in her own right, in her wanting this manifestation of herself at this time and place. The success must also be attributed to the energies and leadership capabilities of Ken Hansen, youthful and knowledgeable chairman of the Samish Indian tribe. It was he who not only anticipated and prepared for each contingency, but did so with a dignity and ceremony that comes only from centuries of proud and respectful sustained tradition. It was Ken Hansen who had members of the State Forest Service search their domains for the right tree. And when it was found and cut, Ken Hansen conducted ceremonies wherein he implored the essence and spirit of this centuries-old cedar tree to give over its own unique and separate identity in order to become the medium through which the spirit of the maiden might take form and substance. As part of the ceremonies, Tracy Powell, the willing carver, was taken up to the area where the tree had grown to become acquainted with the life force and home base of the cedar, so that he might better know the nature of this material. Tracy was also given a ceremonial bath in one of the cold mountain streams that flow through the forest as part of his initiation and preparation to begin the carving. A section of the tree, measuring over 25 foot long and more than 5 foot at the base, was delivered to Tracy Powell's studio, all at little cost and by people who were pleased to be contributing to the project. A log cradle that had been built at Tracy's front yard to receive the huge log, and though there was some fear that it might roll right over in taking it off the truck and crush the studio beyond, the log did roll right into position, just as planned, and just as though it was willing to do its part. With the massive log delivered in ominous form in Tracy Powell's front yard, most of us were awed by the monumental undertaking that we had taken on, a humbling sense that we as puny man-creatures had presumed to snatch a tree from the forest and make it represent the spirit and lively forces of the mighty stirring sea. Go ahead and try. Only realize the nature of the forces you are dealing with. I asked Tracy if he still thought he could do it. After all, we could turn that big hunk of cedar into enough hand-split shakes to make a fortune. But Tracy said no, he could do it. He didn't know how, but it was going to come out all right. Tracy spent a long time walking around the huge log, becoming acquainted with it and preparing himself both in the traditional manner of the Samish and in his own instinctive fashion. In the meantime, he had built a 5-foot model, the Middle Maiden, that incorporated suggestions made after much consultation with Samish elders, structural engineers, and with other carvers and artists. Tracy was ready to begin on the real thing. I had a number of other duties and projects to keep track of during Skagit County's centennial year, not all of them successful and none of them as absorbing as the carving of the maiden pole. I did have the opportunity to spend some time with Samish leaders and with others, preparing publicity and following through on other aspects of the project, though much of the actual coordinating was in the capable hands of the Samish tribal office staff. I did take some school groups and other interested people to see the carving in progress, and I managed to go over to Tracy's about once a week or so. That became known as my maiden fix. I invariably brought my camera along, not that I was required to make any record shots, but solely for my own accounting. Bill Dorsey of KVOS-TV Bellingham was documenting the entire carving process. I want to check with them and see if they still have that footage. And many professional photographers, including those from 2 area newspapers, were recording the development of the project. When Tracy did peel off the bark, roughen his dimensions, and get down to the fine carving, he began with the face of Kokwala-Woot, as he said, so that she could help guide him and tell him how to proceed. It was great fun talking to Tracy and watching him work, for the process was as much adventure and means of discovery for him as it was for the rest of us looking on. He clearly knew his tools, most of which he had made or adapted to his own needs. He also knew the legend and how he wanted to represent it, and he had made his preliminary models. What was exciting for him as well as for us was the way the wood yielded to the knife and the graining of the wood that frequently opened up and suggested new subtleties of idea and design. I was always surprised to see these effects, and talking to Tracy, I gathered that he was also surprised frequently at the way things would turn out, more beautifully than could have been expected or planned for. One instance was the fact that the side he had arbitrarily chosen to begin with as the pure and innocent maiden side turned out to have very few blemishes or imperfections. However, there were many knots and gnarls on the reverse side, which represents her as being transformed by the sea, with its barnacles, kelp, and salt water beginning to work their transformation of her once clear skin and smooth, untangled hair. At about the time that the carving of the maiden was nearly completed, and before the log was to be rolled over to begin the carving of the spirit and creature of the sea, I was aware that there was another ceremonial in the offing for Tracy, this time as an immersion in one of the saltwater bays to prepare him spiritually for that aspect of the carving, and also to acquaint him intimately with the waters that are held to be sacred to Kokwala-Woot. Because of my involvement with the project and with the legend of the maiden, I asked if I might go along with that ceremony. Ken Hansen, almost gleefully it seemed to me, agreed that I should. We gathered about dawn, one early summer morning at Tracy's studio. This was without breakfast. We were transferred from there in Ken's van to the Rosario Beach site. It was a soft gray morning, slightly overcast with clouds and a growing light that seemed to come from objects themselves rather than having light cast on them. I remember leaves on trees standing out as individuals rather than as bunches, and I had never been as aware of birds seeming to fly down and look at us rather than our having to look off and try to see them. As we drove past Campbell Lake, Ken mentioned that a nest of bald eagles had been spotted there, unusual because it was very close to such a busy road. I glanced over aimlessly because I seldom see those things that people are pointing out, but there it was, a huge nest in a hemlock tree with a scraggly young bird staring back at us. We reached Rosario Beach at about the time of dawn, but it did not seem right, and Tracy said as much. Ken agreed, and we drove on over the bridge, past Cornet, and on past the point where the old ferry used to land before the bridge was built. We got out of the van there and walked a good way along the beach until we came to a beautiful sandy point with a huge maple tree spreading over part of the beach. Ken sang and spoke to the waters in an Indian tongue while Tracy and I stripped bare, ready to go in. Then Ken called to us and told us that he had taken the sting out of the cold water. We were to go in, face in each of 4 directions, asking for help in our enterprises, and that all hurt or harmful thing be lifted from us. We would then